Hello, my name is Dr. John Riley. I am a Civil War historian who specializes in fatherhood and family during the Civil War. I specifically look at the experiences of enslaved family men and soldiering family men, black and white, and how the experiences that they went through affected their abilities as parents and the lengths that they went to try and maintain emotional attachments to their wives and children. And this is the first episode of my new series, The Civil War on Paper, the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector. And so this is something that I'm doing. It's a local history project in which I am examining major national events from a local lens. So the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector was a newspaper published right here in Schenectady County, New York, my home. It was begun in 1830 as the Schenectady County Whig. It had a number of name changes over the year. But in 1861, it was the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector, and it was edited by Cyrus Thayer. This weekly four-pager paper cost $1 a year. Since it is presently the 160th anniversary of the Civil War, I wanted to do this project as a way to provide a little context for the events that took place 160 years ago, but also, again, to understand how local news filtered and understood the major things that were going on. Papers are a phenomenal primary source, and it really is kind of an exciting thing to read their interpretations of some of these events, to see what they choose to focus on, and how it affects people at home. So I really hope you enjoy this series as much as I have had putting it together so far. I'll be reading you some of the articles from the paper, as well as providing some commentary and some context, because primary sources are great, and I love when people go to primary sources, but if you don't know what you're looking for, or if you don't have training in the area and you don't know the context, you can often be quite confused about what you're seeing. And so it's my hope to provide you with a little bit of both, some context and the primary source. All right, some information about Schenectady County during the war. Schenectady had a population of 20,002 people, nearly half of which lived in the actual city of Schenectady. The rest were scattered among Duanesburg, Glenville, Rotterdam. There was a small number in Niskayuna. Although nearly 1 in 5 people were foreign born, the population was better than 98% white. Broom manufacturing was by far the county's biggest industry, with investments in brooms commanding 26% of the total value in machinery. In fact, Schenectady County was one of those few counties where the value of machining was higher than that of agriculture, and more people worked at machinery and manufacturing than in agriculture. Broom making was the county's also second largest manufacturing employer, falling slightly behind men's clothing. In the election of 1860, the county favored Lincoln over Douglas, 2,154 to 1,994, giving Lincoln a shy margin of 52%. Still, there are a lot of anti-Lincoln Democrats in the county, which is part of why I wanted to do this project, because it's a fascinating combination that you end up with politically during the war. Pro-war Democrats who aren't necessarily pro-Lincoln, anti-slavery Democrats who will jump ship and join the Republican Party, and anti-Lincoln, anti-war Democrats who say that no effort is worth it and to just let the South go, what have you. And so it's kind of exciting because in this first issue, we have a perspective from a pro-war Democrat who will later turn Republican, and for now, at least, an anti-war Democrat who is lamenting the fact that more compromises couldn't be reached with the South. And we'll look at both of these pieces as we get going. Schenectady did contribute men to the war, primarily in the form of the 134th New York Infantry Regiment, which was mustered into service on September 22nd, 1862. The 134th was assigned to the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division of the 11th Corps. And as such, their principal engagements were the battles of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, after which the 11th and 12th Corps were combined to form the new 20th Corps, and they were attached to General Sherman. And as such, the men from Schenectady took part in the campaign to capture Atlanta, the march across Georgia to Savannah, and were present with the rest of Sherman's men at the end of the war. Schenectady also contributed roughly 50 men to the 13th New York Heavy Artillery, which was actually drawn from all over the state, but primarily the men from Schenectady ended up in either Company E or M. And these men, of which Company E, the 2nd Battalion, from which Company E was a part, actually sent to Virginia, where they took part in the defense of Portsmouth and Norfolk after they were captured in May of '62. So this was not a bad posting, actually. If you were a young, unmarried guy, you might be getting a little stir crazy. But if you were a married guy, this was great. You were far from the action. You were well supplied. Garrison duty was actually quite nice if you were someone who was not looking at this war as a great adventure. If you were, some historians have argued that some of the men in these garrison camps would get quite stir crazy, right? I'm supposed to be taking part in something bigger here, and all I'm doing is guarding civilians. Like, this is boring. But there were other men who, and some of their letters are quite fun to read, who were basically like, this is great. Like, I'm not getting shot at. I wake up every day, I put on my uniform, and, I stand guard. This is the best. This is great. I miss being home, but at least, I could be off in the wilderness doing something worse. So there you have it. Schenectady men served in some of the major engagements that saw changing fortunes in this war. So with that, let's actually get to the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector itself. This is their July 18th, 1861 issue. And we're opening with a speech by the Honorable Lyman Tremaine. Here he is above me, handsome fella. This was a 4th of July speech he gave in Albany. Lyman Tremaine was an attorney in New York. He was also a Democrat turned Lincoln Republican who served as New York's Attorney General for 2 years, from 58 to 60. He's possibly most famous for his successful prosecution of Boss Tweed from Tammany Hall in 1873 for misuse of public funds and embezzlement. His son would also serve as an officer in the 10th New York Cavalry, but was tragically killed very late in the war at Hatcher's Run during the Siege of Petersburg. And so this is what Lyman Tremaine has to say at Albany, 1861. That root of discontent, slavery, is now producing its bitter fruit. Its origin was foreshadowed by Mr. Calhoun in his prophecy that the time was coming when Southern men would be excluded from the honors and emoluments of the government. This was incorrect, for the North has ever been generous and liberal to the statesmen of the South, and when the excitements growing out of the repeal of the Missouri Compromise has subsided, the same kind and generous feelings, it is believed, will resume their sway. But the pretext for secession now is not the tariff, but the slavery question. It is confidently believed that neither was the real gist of the grievance. The conclusion, then, which I draw, fellow citizens, from the whole argument is that secession has no standing place in the Constitution, that it is a monstrous heresy, that it is another name for rebellion, which, when it culminates in acts of war against the United States, is unmitigated treason. Loud cheers, according to the paper. The practical question then comes home to us, who cannot sanction this doctrine. What shall we do? Louisiana was acquired for the United States by Mr. Jefferson at great expense, who exerted for that purpose doubtful powers on account of the great importance of that acquisition to the Union. Can we now consent to see the cordon of states carved out of Louisiana become foreign territory again? Will the mighty West consent that their commerce, on its way over this great highway to the ocean, shall pass through a foreign country? Will she submit to see foreign batteries bristling with cannon on either side of the Mississippi? To which the crowd replies, never. And here I must say something very quickly. Louisiana was actually a bargain for the United States, as we got it for $18 per square mile, an expanse of 828,000 square miles that wasn't really France's to sell. But that's a separate issue. Moreover, this was a fraction of France's original asking price. The French had wanted to sell Louisiana after their attempt to re-establish a Western Hemisphere empire collapsed in Haiti. And the Emperor Napoleon basically threw up his hands and he said, screw it, we're done. I want out. Take Louisiana. The original amount that they asked for was significantly higher than what the United States agreed to sell. Secondly, no dubious powers were used. Although Jefferson opponents really tried making an issue out of this, there's nothing to it. And look, I don't care if you like Jefferson or not. That's beside the point. Anti-Jefferson politicians have been sort of beating this drum for a long time, but the Constitution is pretty clear on this. Presidents can negotiate any treaties that they want with foreign governments, and the Senate has the power to ratify treaties. Land changes hand at the international level one of two ways: conquest and treaty. A land deal is just a treaty. You agree to sell a certain amount of land, and I agree to pay you this amount. And if our respective legislatures approve and fund it, then it is legal. No dubious powers at all. Jefferson negotiated, the Senate ratified, and then the House passed an appropriations bill in order to pay for it. All powers clearly defined by the Constitution. So, there you have it. No dubious powers used, and not really that great of an expense. This really was a bargain. The land is something like 3 cents an acre. The United States would turn around and sell it for something like $1.25 an acre to developers and prospectors. They would also later go on and just give away huge chunks of it to homesteaders, to railway companies. It more than paid back the government in terms of economic growth and expansion. It was also quite deleterious to the multiple groups of Native Americans who lived on it and had no say when a massive chunk of it was sold away. But again, separate issue that we will have to get to as we go along. Back to Tremaine. Texas cost us millions of money and a bloody war with Mexico. Can we consent to see her become foreign territory because she so wills it? Florida cost us many millions and many years of war with the Indians. Can she go because she says she wills it? No, no. We take just pride in the vast extent of territory, extending thousands of miles north and south and east and west, belonging to the Union. Can we tamely consent to see that territory reduced to a strip less than 200 miles in width between Virginia and Canada? Our nation has risen to the first rank among the nations of the earth, and its position is a source of just exultation and pride to every true American. Shall we now consent to see it sink down to a degraded level with Mexico and the petty republics of South America? To which the crowd yells, never. And here's another point. America's empire wasn't accidental. It was deliberately built. For a long time, historians talked about the fact that the United States acquires so much territory and later overseas territory as sort of accidental, right? If we have an empire, which we don't, they said, we stumbled into it, right? It was an empire by accident. No, it wasn't. It was deliberately built, right? We did not invade and subjugate multiple indigenous peoples. We did not provoke a war with Mexico and then take 1/3 of their territory. We did not overthrow a sovereign monarchy in Hawaii by accident. Each one of these steps designed to extend American influence, to extend our opportunities for commerce, for power projection, you name it, right? The United States empire building in the Pacific is textbook case of 19th century imperialism. It was by design. And as you can see, it's celebrated. In the 19th century, it was commonly celebrated that the United States had spilt blood and treasure to extend its borders. They had no qualms about the word empire. In fact, they celebrated it. The United States was becoming one. Back to Tremaine. In short, can we, as men and as citizens, and shall we acquiesce in the Southern claim of secession with all its disastrous consequences? Crowd shouts, we will not. To this question, I hear one universal response. It comes from the 1.5 million Northern voters who, with myself, voted against Mr. Lincoln for president. He would have voted for Stephen Douglas, the Democratic nominee. It comes from New England and New York, from the Middle States, from the Great West and Northwest. It comes from the cemeteries where repose the ashes of the heroes and patriots of the Revolution. That response is no, never, 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 to which he receives loud cheers. And I want to say something here because he specifically mentions the graves of the revolutionary generation. Both sides in the Civil War laid claim to the spirit of '76 and boasted of themselves to be the true inheritors of the revolution, while Southerners often claimed it due to them fighting a second rebellion against the alleged tyranny of something, whatever it was that the North was doing to them or going to do to them. Northerners were quite clear that they feared the collapse of representative and elective government in the United States. If you look abroad, this was very much a possibility. Already the world was turning away from democracies and republics. The French experiment had gone from republic to empire to a restored monarchy. Reformers and those who wanted to see a middle-class parliament emerge in Prussia and in Germany had been violently suppressed and driven abroad. The map of Europe was dominated by largely conservative monarchies that had absolute control of their territories. And they're all watching, waiting for this experiment in the United States to fail. Many of the Latin American democracies at this point are struggling, falling to military juntas and strongmen. Now, the United States does play some role in some of this, but be clear, when you're looking at the numbers of republics on the world stage, it's shrinking, not growing. And for Northerners, the great fear was that if a section of the country can simply take their ball and go home whenever they lose a free and open election, which they did, then there'd be nothing but endless subdivision of the country. First the South would leave, then parts of the West would leave. In the South, different parts of the South would leave. If you don't like who gets voted for governor, part of a state will leave. If the county doesn't like who's elected, part of the county leaves, and on and on and on. The southern states had agreed to adhere to a set of rules for a national election, rules that they had been perfectly fine with while they had been winning. Remember, prior to Lincoln winning this election, the overwhelming number of presidents had come from the South, specifically Virginia. Lincoln's election saw a president win without carrying a single southern state, and it set off alarm bells. And they were presented with two choices. You could have better ideas and win a national election by appealing to a coalition of voters, or you could just quit and create a country where the only people who are going to vote are people who think like you. And they went with door B. And that is the problem. That shows the rot at the core of the Confederacy's ideology. They were fine with strong federal power so long as they had been the ones in high federal office. And the moment they weren't, they threw a fit and they left, which was a dangerous precedent that Northerners, whose parents and grandparents had lived through the Revolution and some of whom had fought in the Revolution, found completely unacceptable. Right? The men of '76 and the women of '76 did not fight and shed blood so that every time you lost an election, you could just quit. That's what he's invoking here when he talks about this, and he mentions the hollowed ashes of the Revolution. If the South had remained within the Union, according to Tremaine, if she had refrained from her aggressive attacks upon the government and the flag, I would have vindicated her claims to the last, and if necessary, would have shouldered the musket in defense of her constitutional rights. But when she makes war upon the Constitution to which my allegiance is due, and which I have so often taken an oath to support, when the Secretary of War of the Southern Confederacy openly vaunts that the capital of my country will soon be in possession of Confederate troops, and the Confederate flag will soon float from Faneuil Hall, when the Charleston Mercury boasts that Confederate armies will ere long make their way to the Hudson, when Southern statesmen declare that they are openly carrying out the cherished plans of many years, and that if the North would give them a carte blanche with authority to write over it their own terms and conditions for returning to the Union, the South would spurn the proposal. When the flag of my country is insulted and spit upon by the South, we accept the necessity which is forced upon us, and trust the result to the God of battles. Tremendous cheers. I should say, at this time, the Confederacy's Secretary of War was a man named LeRoy Pope Walker. If you've never heard of him, don't be too upset. He's kind of a dud. He's actually most famous for being one of the apostles of disunion. That is, the men who were appointed as secession commissioners who traveled around to other slave states trying to persuade them to join the Confederacy when it was in its infancy. After resigning his cabinet post due to stress, he briefly commands rebel defenses in Alabama before resuming a law career after the war. He's largely eclipsed by later war secretaries such as Judah P. Benjamin and John C. Breckinridge. And what Tremaine here is referring to is he once famously boasted that D.C. would fall to the rebels in May of 1861. He was wrong. The grand uprising of the people, in response to the president's appeal, presented a spectacle of majestic grandeur that the world has rarely witnessed. I will not undertake to predict the final result of this most unfortunate and dreadful contest, but it seems to me very clear that to acquiesce in this Southern claim of secession and to allow the Union to be torn to atoms without one single struggle to defend it would be an exhibition of imbecility, tending strongly to prove that the people who exhibit it were unworthy of the government which they were struggling to dissolve. It is our duty to resist this secession dogma by all the means in our power, and only to acquiesce in it after a full and fair experiment shall have proved that we cannot help ourselves. Then only will our responsibility cease. Let us, however, carry the olive branch in one hand, while the sword gleams in the other. Let the South know that with returning allegiance on their part, the arms will drop from our grasp. Let them learn that the war is waged, not to exterminate slavery, but to defend the Union. And here I must say something about slavery being the cause of the war, because it was, 100%. I don't care what your great-grandfather told you about the real history of the war, because the documents exist and they are abundantly clear that the nation had been nursing a 70-year grudge over the existence of slavery. Congress does not institute a gag order over the question of tariffs. Churches, like the Methodists and the Baptists, did not split into northern and southern congregations over the issues of taxation. Southern families didn't stop sending their kids to northern schools over the issue of internal improvements. Southern Democrats didn't walk out of the National Convention in 1860 twice over the issue of textiles. It all came back to slavery. And you will still find to this day people arguing, either in bad faith or out of frightful ignorance, that because the United States did not explicitly start out seeking to free slaves, that slavery was somehow not the cause of the war. Southerners were abundantly clear on the fact that they wanted out because they feared for the future of slavery in the United States. And you had plenty of people like Tremaine here who tried to dissuade those concerns by arguing that the war wasn't going to be about that. But as we know, Black Americans refused to be sidelined. And by running away to Union lines, by voting with their feet, by voting in the North, they wrote letters to congressmen and governors and the president himself. They made the war about more than just the preservation of the Union. So yes, the cause of the war was slavery. The reason that 11 states choose to bolt was directly tied to the defense of a system of human chattel that they refused to relinquish, or to even consider a future where it did not exist. These two things can both be true: that the Lincoln administration did not initially set out to set slaves free, and that the Confederacy sought to create a perpetual slaveholding republic based explicitly in white supremacy. Those two truths can coexist, and they do not negate each other. Back to Tremaine. Teach them, then, in every way, that no invasion of their constitutional rights is contemplated, and none will be tolerated. Teach them, too, that the great body of the people of the North have no malice or vindictive feelings to gratify, that they do not sympathize with that mischievous band of lunatics who have been so long making war upon their feelings and their rights. He's talking about abolitionists. Again, most Northerners don't really care what's going on with Black people in the South. They might not like slavery, but they're not going to actively fight to get rid of it. That will change as the war progresses. But for now, he's talking about those lunatics in places like New England with their isms like abolitionism, and the crowd cheers. It's interesting, though, he doesn't talk about the other group who have zero interest in compromise, and those are Southern fire eaters, people who refused any form of compromise whatsoever and actively pushed the countries to the brink of war by making sure that they got out. They wanted out because that was the way they saw the future of their republic. Here, he's just going to make fun of some abolitionists. That's low-hanging fruit for a politician in 1860. Fellow citizens, I must now close my appeal. I plead before you this day for the American Union. I know well how much my plea falls below the dignity and importance of the subject. The American Union, what a theme for the orator and the poet. It is the same Union which, while I speak, extends its protection over 30 millions of free men. The same Union which has so long rendered the name of America honored at home and abroad. The same Union which sheds from land to land and pole to pole a light clear and brilliant as if it were hung up midway in the heavens. The Union around which cluster 34 free and powerful states. The same glorious Union beneath whose blessed influences our land has extended from sea to sea, and our citizens may stand upon the Atlantic or Pacific coast and invite downtrodden humanity from Europe or Asia. And here the paper becomes illegible, which is a great shame because he's actively making an argument for immigration, something Americans had zero problems with in 1860. They loved how much the population of the country was increasing, and they weren't really wringing their hands about how foreign-born they were, with the exception of groups of know-nothings, and they're kind of a flash in the pan. This will, however, rear its head again as we get to the end of the century, and people start using lovely eugenics terms like, race suicide, and the fact that white women were not having enough babies, and so that comes back to haunt us, and it really is kind of an ugly chapter. But in this moment, we're still celebrating the fact that America should be welcoming the downtrodden from abroad. I just wish that part of the paper had been a little bit more legible because I can't even make a guess as to what it says. It's about 3 or 4 lines and they're just gone. Cling to this union, my countrymen, while it lasts. Defend it at home and abroad. Defend it in prosperity. Defend it in adversity. Defend it at all times, in all places, and under all circumstances. I will not believe that this union must now be destroyed. Let us hope that its authority will once more be restored in all places where it is not displaced. Let us hope that in the hands of that almighty power. Let me try that again because his phrasing here is great and I just stumbled over it. Let us hope that in the hands of that almighty power, who has upheld it for so many years, it will survive the attacks of its enemies and accomplish its high destiny. Cheers from the crowd. Let us hope that centuries hence this festival of the 4th of July will be celebrated with more pomp and splendor than it has been this day. That then, the smoke having cleared away, we shall see the American eagle soaring aloft in higher flights than ever, and the pillars of our government shining forth in renewed and still greater beauty and strength, and that millions yet unborn will rise up to bless the memory of the patriot heroes who framed the Union in 1787, and of their faithful descendants who, by crushing out the great rebellion of 1861, were enabled to transmit it to them, unimpaired, the precious inheritance handed down from their fathers. Long continued applause. That is quite the speech. And again, coming from an anti-Lincoln Democrat. He would have voted for Stephen Douglas, and yet here he is, making full support of the government in its efforts to suppress the Southern Confederacy, particularly after the attack on Fort Sumter. All right. On page 2, we actually have we have a column from the paper's editor, Cyrus Thayer. His column is optimistically titled No Hope from Congress. And I really wanted to just juxtapose these two. You have the 4th of July speech from Lyman Tremaine, in which he uses very similar language in a lot of ways to the talk that Cyrus Thayer will give here. but for very different ends. Tremaine is talking about the power of the government to uphold the legacy of the revolution. Thayer is going to, he's far less sanguine about the government's use of force to oppose suppression. He chooses instead to grasp to the, as history has shown, misguided notion that the South could be persuaded to abandon its course with compromise after compromise. And this is actually a common lost cause talking point, that the Civil War was somehow the fault of anyone and everyone other than Southern secessionists, that their course was somehow justified, and that the defense of perpetual slavery, later amended to become the ever vague states' rights, was because it was forced to them by the North. So Thayer is actually playing right into that narrative here, and it's actually fascinating to read his take on these events, as he's anticipating many of the arguments that we will hear from sort of neo-Confederates and lost causers even to this day. So here we have the editor of the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector, Cyrus Thayer. Those who have been looking to the present Congress for the development of some measure that would point towards a peaceful solution of the difficulties that now besets us as a nation must turn with disgust from the bloodthirsty craftiness that overawes all its proceedings. No prohibition or measure that has not the smell of blood in its provisions can receive a respectful consideration. Mob law is threatened those members who have a desire to do something to calm the passions of men and stay the further effusions of human gore. Powerful language here. The votaries of peace must sit dumb before the Robespierres of the higher law and see their beloved country torn to atoms and the offspring of their own blood slaughtered like barbarians at the command of the lordly Molochs who hold the reins of government. Congress votes thousands of men and millions of money to be wrung from the hard earnings of the people, to carry on a fratricidal contest, but have no time to listen to propositions of peace, or to investigate the wrongs complained of, so that justice and mercy may go hand in sustaining a constitutional government. Those who expect to restore the Union by such a course must be blind indeed. A government that refuses justice to its people cannot long survive the vengeance that awaits it. A government that is only held together by force is worse than no government. And the party onset of men that attempts to trample upon all propositions that will tend to ameliorate the wrongs of a large minority of the people cannot long enjoy the power entrusted to them. A party to retain power must temper justice with mercy, and where evils, apprehended or real, he's qualifying himself a little bit here, right? Where evils, apprehended or real, are complained of, it must seek in an honorable way to remove them in order to stand justified before a civilized world. The olive branch should always precede the sword, and unless this course is pursued, the war will become the most unpopular and devastating known to modern history. It is right and proper that Congress should place in the hands of the administration the men and means to sustain the government, but at the same time it should throw around these supplies such safeguards and restrictions as will ensure to those who complain of injustice a speedy removal of whatever dangers they may apprehend. Congress should see that every provision of the Constitution is lived up to by the executive power, to the end that those who seek to enforce the laws may not themselves become the violators. To the end that those, and then, I just read the same sentence twice, and when differences arise as to the expectation or validity of any law, both Congress and the executive should be prepared to abide by the law as decided by the highest tribunal known to the Constitution. Unless these principles prevail in this war, Republican government is at an end. It's a fascinating editorial. It's largely lamenting the failure of anti-war Democrats to secure an avoidance of the conflict through peaceful means. And there's two primary things here that Thayer would be referring to. One was the ill-fated Crittenden Compromise. This was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would have made slavery unamendable and perpetual, as well as rolling back about 30 years of political compromise in order to restore a situation more favorable to Southerners. It was a complete non-starter for Lincoln and the Republican Party. The very point of the Constitution is that it is changeable. That is why we have an amendment process. In fact, some of the most cherished parts of the Constitution, things that protect your civil liberties in the case of criminal trials and prevent the state from simply locking you up without trial. Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Eighth Amendments, these are key. Come out of the amendment process, right? They're the Bill of Rights. The Constitution is never meant to be static and unchanging and unyielding. Not even the founders thought that. Jefferson himself had said that every 19 years you should just tear up all laws and governments and start over. Obviously, that's not practical. But by having an amendment process, each generation has the option to change and hopefully improve our charter of government. But to make something that is unamendable, it's simply unacceptable. Doubly so because it enshrined slavery for all time. Southerners and Northerners in the House both vote this down. Secondly, Thayer would be referring to the failed peace conference that was held in D.C. in February of 1861. The importance of this thing has been really overblown. None of the 7 states that had already declared themselves seceded bothered to even send anybody. As far as they were concerned, they weren't interested in coming back peacefully. They were very clear on that. And most of those who went for this are either old men way past their political use, right? They made a great deal about the fact that they got a former president to preside over it. Nobody cared what this guy thought. Or they were young men of no status or recognition. And so it's basically just an ad hoc group of people meeting in a hotel with no official sanction from the United States government. And while there, they try to come up with a better compromise to keep the country together. And after 3 weeks of work, about the best they can do is a 7-point plan that you could realistically just call the Crittenden Compromise 2.0. It's barely different than the original one that the Congress rejected. The conference itself is pretty dissatisfied with it. They barely vote for it. 9 states saying yes, 8 states saying no. So even a sizable number of the states that are there don't love this new compromise. And by the way, nobody outside of this hotel cares. It does go to Senate. The Senate overwhelmingly rejects it, and the House doesn't even bother with it. The House never even has a vote to discuss it. And so when the 36th Congress adjourns in March of 61, there's no formal avenue left for negotiations anyway. By the time we get to this date, 160 years ago, July of 61, the 37th Congress is in session. That Congress is completely controlled by Republicans because they win enough votes that they have dominance of both chambers. And with the White House, they have a government trifecta. And that is what Thayer is lamenting, is that for the first time, you don't have Democrats in the most important posts in the legislature because they're now the House minority leaders, not the majority leaders. And they're having to watch as another party that did win the majority of the votes sets the agenda. And they're following Lincoln's lead here. And that lead is, no, the country's not divisible. Stop it. Thayer doesn't like that. So there's some context there for his comments. There is another section on page 2 where it seems to disparage the president, Congress, the courts, and the soldiers sort of all at once. Here it is, quote, "The president, in his message, gives the volunteers a big puff. He says there is scarcely a regiment from which there could not be selected a president, a cabinet, Congress, and perhaps a court, abundantly competent to administer the government itself." It's quite a compliment. "Judging by the caliber of the men who sometimes constitutes cabinets and congresses and write messages, the president is about right." Ouch! Holy cow, that is brutal and biting. That's just, I remember coming across that. It's in the section actually not far behind me where they're talking about like the size of the army France has. There's some local news about a fire. And then all of a sudden you have this section. And I just remembered thinking, holy cow. Here we go. There it is. Just directly above me right now. Gives the volunteers a big puff, right? Judging by the caliber of the men who sometimes constitute cabinets and congresses, the president is about right. They're no better than, lowly soldiers. Ouch. There is also a section on the same page about news from the war. And I want to say this is July 18th of 1861. The big battle at Bull Run has not yet occurred. So these victories are incredibly small, yet they will have longer term consequences. And so I want to mention a couple of these because they refer to a fight at Monroe, Missouri, as well as a fight at Rich Mountain, Virginia. And the two of these do have some pretty interesting consequences long term, as well as introduce us to some players who will be big names. So the first is the rescue of Colonel Smith's men of the 16th Illinois and 3rd Iowa Infantries, as well as some of the Hannibal Home Guards, who had been surrounded by a militia raised by Confederate General Thomas Harris. Harris's men numbered about 1,500, and they had managed to isolate and surround Smith's 500 men in a brick building called the Seminary. Smith's men had been sent to the area to disperse gathering rebels and to arrest General Harris, who was formerly a Missouri legislator in the legislature. But after a scouting party loyal to Harris opened fire on Smith's men, wounding 3 and killing a horse, Smith began to withdraw towards Monroe City, only to find himself surrounded. Think Lexington and Concord, right? This was a decapitation strike. Smith's men set out to capture a prominent Confederate officer, and when they were unable to get him and returned home, sympathetic rebels started to just come out of the woodwork, and before long, Smith's men found themselves wildly outnumbered. They also found that their escape by train at Monroe City had been cut off, and so rather than try and fight their way out, they held up at the seminary to await reinforcements and hopefully fight off the rebels. The rebels began to surround them. They did have a couple pieces of serviceable artillery, a 6 and a 9-pounder, so 2 cannon, but they lacked enough artillery rounds for their 9-pounder. And what I mean by 9-pounder is it refers to the caliber and weight of the cannonballs. What they did have was lots of rounds for their 6-pounder. So since they're smaller, they do technically fit in the 9-pounder barrel. Firing 6-pound balls out of a 9-pound gun proved dangerous at best, as at least one ball traveled a mere 30 feet before it ricocheted off the ground and sailed a quarter of a mile to the left into a crowd of people who had gathered to watch the spectacle and sent civilians scurrying as cannonballs came by. One member of this sort of secessionist militia joked that the only safe place to stand when firing the 9-pounder was in front of it. Which I love that anecdote. So the rebels under Harris tried shelling Smith's position, but the 6-pounder didn't have enough range and the gun wasn't really doing a lot of work, so they moved their cannons closer. Once they came into range, Smith's own men, with their own 6-pounder, fired back, and his skilled Federal gunners quickly dismounted the rebels' smaller cannon, as in they struck it, damaged it, knocked it off its carriage. It can't be used anymore. This really takes the wind out of the men under Harris's command, and they quickly withdraw their 9-pounder to a safe distance. But they also don't leave, and so you have this standoff. However, Smith gets reinforced the following day by a train that arrives at Monroe City, carrying the balance of the 16th Illinois, as well as a larger brass 9-pound cannon, which they promptly begin to discharge into the ranks that are surrounding Smith's position. And according to eyewitness reports, between these reinforcements and Colonel Smith's men fighting their way back out of the seminary, the rebels quickly rout and do their best to try and blend into the surrounding environment. Now, some of the men with Harris withdraw in good order, but most of the rest of these sort of Missouri Minutemen who show up, there's actual reports that they tried to blend back into the crowd. They're like throwing away their guns, they're throwing away their uniforms, and they're like, slipping in line with the people, pretending like they weren't just shooting at federal soldiers. Um, and so we have this glorious victory, so called, in which basically a surrounded group of Union soldiers are able to return home. But it also gives some testament to the sentiment that's going on in Missouri, right? This is not a friendly pro-Lincoln place. And you have some of the worst irregular violence of the war taking place in places like Missouri and the Trans-Mississippi West, regions that didn't always get as much attention by Civil War historians, because it wasn't, the rank and file field armies and the pitched battles of the East or the Western departments. And I have to tell you, though, that this irregular violence matters. The guerrillas, the sort of mixed cavalry, and units armed with shotguns, it's personal, it's local, and it's been getting a lot more attention in the last 10 years. And I have to say, that's really a good thing. It rounds out our scholarship knowledge immensely. And so we have this pretty much the only pitched battle that takes place in northern Missouri during the war. And there you go, they're reporting on it. Now, the other one that they describe here is the battle at Rich Mountain, Virginia, and the following battle at Carricksford. So these were small operations that served as the opening maneuvers, and I should say probably closing maneuvers, of the West Virginia campaign. So June of 1861, Major General George B. McClellan, that should be a familiar name, assumes command of U.S. forces in Western Virginia. McClellan's Army of the Ohio comprised of 5 brigades, 2 of which are detached under the command of Brigadier General Thomas Morris, who's stationed at Laurel Hill. McClellan's 3 remaining brigades, one of which is commanded by William Rosecrans, another name familiar to Civil War scholars, is focused on seizing the strategically important turnpike in southern Virginia that links Staunton and Parkersburg. This vital roadway connects the upper Shenandoah Valley to the Ohio River, and it is a crucial supply line for the fledgling Confederates. Opposing McClellan in West Virginia was Robert Garnett's small army of the Northwest at Laurel Hill, with Lieutenant John Pegram holding the pass at Rich Mountain. Rosecrans' brigade pushed through the pass on July 11th and over the course of 2 hours managed to split the Confederate line. Half of the rebels fled and sort of dissolved into the surrounding hillside, but Pegram and the rest surrendered 2 days later. With his position now vulnerable and unsustainable, General Garnett tried to withdraw his army, but he found himself being pursued on July 13th by men of Thomas Morris's Indiana Brigade. Now that's comprised of the 6th, 7th, and 9th Indiana, as well as artillery from Ohio. General Garnett engaged in a fighting retreat, constantly pursued and engaged by Morris. And while personally directing the rearguard action, Garnett is struck and killed instantly by federal fire. And with the loss of their commanding officer, the remaining Confederates retreat in disarray or surrender. This sort of 2-prong operation, the opening of the pass at Rich Mountain and then the running battle at Carricksford, secures West Virginia for the United States for the remainder of the war. But it also makes national heroes of McClellan and Rosecrans. McClellan's command of the Army of the Potomac directly stems from the fact that he was the commanding officer that secured West Virginia. And the initiative that he showed here really won him a lot of friends. And they were like, that's the guy to win the war. We'll come back to that because, as we know, he has a difficult relationship with Lincoln. And he, I think fairly, is criticized for being a poor battlefield commander, but he is also an incredibly capable logistics administrator. And he is able to take the Army of the Potomac from being an organization that loses the Battle of First Bull Run to being an incredibly efficient fighting machine. And although it does lose other battles, let's be honest, that army was in great condition and kept fighting despite losses, and was able to eventually turn the tide and then pursue and capture General Lee's army. So the Army of the Potomac, while it got better battlefield commanders over time, it owes a lot of its early organizational efficiency to McClellan. And it's part of why McClellan was so popular. He got the soldiers what they needed and made sure that they took pride in their unit and really made this volunteer army into something respectable and professional. But yeah, here he is. He gets his start in West Virginia at Carricksford. And the rest, as they say, is history. All right. I'd like to turn. So we've got two pieces by Democrats, Schenectady's own Cyrus Thayer and Lyman Tremaine. We've had news from the war. We've had a couple quippy anecdotes. I'd like to end with something that I think is one of the most fascinating pieces that I found, and it's actually on page 3. So how these 4 pages work is really your principal news is on the first 2 pages. National news, local news. And by the way, you'll notice some of this stuff is just completely reprinted from other newspapers. That was wildly common in the 19th century. We don't have copyright in the same way that we think of it today. So if you saw something in a national paper that you wanted to reprint, you just reprinted it, like word for word. And that was just how the news got around. And so some of these stories come straight from other places and so forth. But once you get to page 3 and 4, it's advertisements. And they run the gamut. Local businesses, energy, there's train schedules, you've got things on, the prices of coal, what the stock markets are up to, and all this and all that. And right in the middle of page 3, I came across an ad that was so good. I just have to talk about it because, oh my gosh, it's fantastic. Here it is. The Great English Remedy. Sir James Clark's celebrated female pills, protected by royal letters patent. This invaluable medicine is unfailing in the cure of those painful and dangerous diseases to which the female constitution is subject. It moderates all excess and removes all obstructions, and a speedy cure may be relied on. To married ladies, it is peculiarly suited. It will, in short time, bring on the monthly period with regularity. Each bottle, priced $1, bears the government stamp of Great Britain to prevent counterfeits. And actually, you can see here above me, wrong hand, I have a picture of one of these from the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston. They actually have a bottle of this, and this is from their website. Caution, in big letters, caution. These pills should not be taken by females during the first 3 months of pregnancy, as they are sure to bring on miscarriage, but at any other time they are safe. This ad is phenomenal because what are we actually selling here, right? They're incredibly vague about what this cures, besides from painful and dangerous diseases to which the female constitution is subject. Not people, just women. It moderates excess. It removes obstructions. Married ladies, this will help you get your period back on track. What is the one thing that stops your period, sure as anything? Pregnancy. These are abortion pills. This is how you advertised and sold these in the 19th century. People trying to sell abortifacient couldn't just say abortion pills. The 19th century had very strict and punishing anti-obscenity laws. You couldn't just go out and say things like that. What you had to do was get clever. And look, hard truth moment here. Humans have been controlling their fertility a long time. In different cultures and across time and space, it has looked differently and taken on different forms. But whether through infanticide, or birth control, or abortion, or a combination thereof, women have been finding ways to keep control of their own bodies. And it did not take early humans long to figure out which plants and herbs would produce miscarriages. For crying out loud, one of the main ingredients in these pills, pretty much the only ingredient worth talking about, was something called oil of savin. This is a pungent oil produced by the plant Juniperus sabina, or the savin Jupiter. It might be savin. I've learned this word by reading it, not hearing it pronounced. But this oil is a known abortion-inducing oil. People have known that for centuries. People knew that taking this oil was a surefire way to terminate a pregnancy. What's better is that these advertisements had been appearing in newspapers unaltered since the 1840s. There is, in fact, a historical Sir James Clark, and he was a physician in Britain. He has absolutely nothing to do with these pills. In fact, as a physician, he knew that ingesting too much of this oil was actually fatal. And in fact, tried to take pharmacists who used his name to court. It didn't matter. He couldn't chase down every single newspaper guy who ran one of these ads. And it didn't matter that he didn't endorse them. It was the legitimacy of the ad that mattered. Look at it. It's got the seal of Queen Victoria on it, protected by royal letters patent. It says, beware of counterfeits. Make sure you only ask for the Job Moses importer. That's the only one who you should be watching out for. It looks so official, and it's clearly there in plain English. This is the other part I love. Removes obstructions, brings on the monthly period with great regularity. It cures the most painful and dangerous diseases to which women were vulnerable. Childbirth was dangerous and extremely painful. This is about as obvious as you could get without getting in trouble. And look, like it or not, people were buying these. Women were inducing miscarriage as a way to control their fertility in the 19th century. We actually have a clear declining trajectory of births among white women in the 19th century. It drops precipitously as time goes on. And one of the reasons is because women are exerting more and more control over their own fertility. And this is one of the ways they're doing that. Now, to be clear, there's actually a number of court cases about these pills. Because, look, people aren't stupid. They know exactly what is being advertised. And there were some who did not like it. They did not like that women were having access to this medicine. Others brought suits because women died from taking these pills. Because that is what you had to go through in order to try and regulate your fertility in the 19th century. Was a deadly oil that if you ingested just a little bit too much of it, could kill you. And there's quite a few places where men and families sued because someone took this and didn't just have an abortion, but died. And I couldn't believe, like, this is the first issue, and there it is, right on the page. The celebrated female pills, abortion pills, in 1861. Ah. All right. That is all for today. Of course, there's so much more in this paper. There are columns accusing the president of tyranny because he raised men to suppress the rebellion. There's comments talking about the suspension of habeas corpus in the South, suspension of habeas corpus in Maryland. There's reports of the proceedings of Congress with literal verbatim exchanges between members of the cabinet and congressmen. So much. And I really do encourage you, if you enjoy history at all, to check out your local historical society and see what they have available, because so much has been made available digitally now. And it really is a golden time to be doing research, whether it's for fun, whether it's for your career, whether it's genealogical. You never know what you're going to find in local papers. And that's why I started doing this, because I want to see what's in here. And I'm looking forward to being surprised as much as hopefully you are, because I've only read a few issues ahead. I don't have time to sit and read 5 years worth of newspapers in a single go. But two, I'm also looking forward to discovering things with you as we go. And that to me is going to be a lot of fun. So with any luck, you enjoyed this as much as I did. Offered some things to think about as we're discussing the Civil War here. Now, next week, there is not going to be an issue because either the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector did not publish one, or if they did, it has not survived. So we don't actually have another issue until early August. It's actually, I had this date in my head and then I left it, August 1st. So there's no issue July 25th, but there is an August 1st issue. And so in 2 weeks, I will be back and I will see you then. It is packed full of news about the disastrous battle at First Bull Run, about the prospects for a peaceful resolution, which are rapidly diminishing, as well as all sorts of local news that I can't wait to dissect with you. So if you've enjoyed this, I would just ask, please give a follow on Twitch so you can be notified of when I go live, and I'd love to talk with you in real time about history, as well as if you're seeing this on YouTube, please give a like and subscribe, and you'll be notified the next time I go live with one of these. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you have a great night, and good luck in all of your own historical research.